just hurried along. I still thought his idea was crazy. Well, dangerous anyway. When we got to the bottom of the hill, we stopped to get our breath and look through the binoculars again. As plain as day, now we could see an old-fashioned lantern and a man digging with a spade right beside the swamp rosebush where we'd been digging that afternoon. "We'll have to hurry," Poetry said excitedly. "Look what a big hole he's got already." We stooped down low and crawled along as quietly as we could until we were so close that if we'd made any noise he'd hear us, and that would spoil everything. Now we could see it was the same old man we'd seen the afternoon with the long white hair and the long beard, and he was working terribly fast. Then I looked at Poetry and guessed what he was going to do, for he was putting on the disguise, whiskers, and wig. "Listen," he said in my ear. "You lie flat on the ground right here, and when I let out a long ghost laugh, you turn a flashlight on me quick, and leave it on until I start to moaning and talking crazy. Then you turn it off. When I start laughing again, you turn it on quick again." Poetry stood up and started waving his hands and arms, and then with that squawky voice of his, which sounded more like a ghost than any real ghost ever sounded, he started a blood-curdling wail like a screech owl with a bad cold. I turned the flashlight on him just as he started that wailing. Honest, if I hadn't known who it was, I'd have been almost scared to death. He was swinging his arms and his pajamas were flapping, and it was enough to scare anybody. Then Poetry started the most awful moaning you ever heard and saying slowly, "I am Old Man Paddler's ghost." He yelled the word "ghost" in a deep voice, like a man's. Then he let out a terrible laugh and sent the shivers up and down my spine once again. I kept the flashlight turned on him and watched him, waving his white pajamas and looking even worse than a ghost. Well, sir, that man dropped his spade and looked around as if he was scared out of his wits. But in a flash he jumped up and dashed lickety-sizzle straight towards Poetry. Both hands were stretched out in front of him as if he was going to grab Poetry and choke him to death. And just that second, two shadows darted out from behind some bushes. One of them made a dive for the man's legs in football style, and a voice, it was Big Jim's voice, yelled for us to come and help. I tell you, I was glad to hear Big Jim. To tell you the truth, I was pretty badly scared and not wanting to let Poetry know it. It turned out that Big Jim and Circus, who lived across the road from each other, had decided maybe they'd better stand guard at that rose bush tonight for fear somebody would spoil everything. So they'd hidden in the bushes, having gotten there just a few minutes before we did, coming up the creek from the other direction. In two shakes of a lamb's tail, all four of us, Big Jim, Circus, Poetry, and I, were scrambling all over the man. His white hair and whiskers came off just as Poetry's thought they would. And we saw he had black hair, the same color as the radio had said the bank robber was supposed to have. The man struck out with his big fists and kicked and and swore. One of his fists caught me on the chin and knocked me flat. It didn't hurt much at the time because I was so mad, and things don't seem to hurt so much when you're mad. But I didn't stay down. In a second, I was right in the thick of that fight again. I got there just in time to see Poetry's big right foot with his heavy shoe kick the man right in the shin. and the man let out a yell of pain. I was glad right that minute that Poetry had big feet. I dived in head first and got a hold of one of the man's legs, and Circus grabbed the other. We held on like a couple of bulldogs, or maybe like a pair of snap turtles holding on to a boy's toes. Pretty soon we had the man down on his stomach with Poetry lying right across his shoulders and head. Big Jim knew all the best wrestling tricks, and as I told you before, he was terribly strong. Well, he'd gotten that man's arms behind him in what's called the arm grapevine hold, and that's how it had been so easy for us to get him down and keep him there, in spite of the man's yelling and kicking and swearing and threatening to kill us. When he was locked up in jail the next day, we learned another reason it had been so easy to keep him down. He had one eye swollen almost shut where Big Jim had hit him with his big fist. It took Big Jim's knuckles almost a week to get completely well. He'd hit the man so hard. Anyway, that's where little Jim's gunny sack came in handy. We'd left it there at the rose bush when we'd been scared away in the afternoon. As I told you, Big Jim knew how to tie 21 different kinds of knots. Well, he knew how to make a rope too. He took his knife and cut that sack into strips and twisted them together. In almost no time at all, we had that robber's legs and hands tied so that he couldn't get away. After we got him tied, we didn't know what to do with him. "What'll we do with him?" Big Jim asked. "Let's bury him," Circus suggested, not meaning it, of course. He's got his grave already dug. That started our prisoner to swearing as I'd never heard any man swear in my life. I was glad little Jim wasn't there because he just naturally loved Jesus so much that when anybody used his name like that, it made little Jim feel terribly bad. The man began to kick and squirm and try to get loose, not knowing that Big Jim was an expert at tying knots. Then all of a sudden, Circus let out a yell and picked up something shiny that had been lying right there on the ground by the man's lantern. At first I could barely believe my eyes, but there it was in Circus's hand, as plain as day, an honest-to-goodness revolver. I guess our faces were pretty sober. Sober? Yeah, I think it is sober. Sober right then, for we realized how serious things were, and how maybe one of us might have been shot. I didn't tell any of the boys at that time, although I did tell Poetry later, but I just shut my eyes for a moment and whispered a thank you prayer. "Dear God," I said, "thank you for not letting any of us boys be killed." And I was thankful too, I can tell you. Big Jim took the gun, opened it, and saw it was loaded. Then he said grimly in a voice that sounded awful fierce, "And now, Mr. Whoever you are, I've got your gun pointing right straight towards you. You lie still while we get the sheriff. Poetry was delegated. Wait, yeah, I think that is delegated. Poetry was delegated to run home for his dad, which he did. His father phoned the sheriff and then came down himself to help us guard the robber until the police got there. That black-haired man must have thought Poetry was a real ghost, or else that old man Paddler had come to life again, or he wouldn't have been so upset. Anyway, that's what I was thinking that night while we were going back to Poetry's tent. We'd gotten to the rosebush just in time. 2, I thought, for right down in the hole where the robber had been digging, we'd found a rusty steel box, which must have been buried by Old Man Paddler himself. Of course, as Poetry's dad said, while we were all still waiting there in the lantern light for the sheriff to come back, taking turns holding that steel box in our laps, Barry Boylan will have to prove he is really and truly Old Man Paddler's nephew before his treasure, or whatever it is, will be given to him. Well, at last Poetry and I were on our cots again, with those same stars looking down at us through the opening of the tent, with the same wind sighing through the leaves and the maple overhead. Of course, we weren't going to get to sleep right away because we were pretty excited and so pleased with ourselves that we didn't know what to do. But then I got sleepier and sleepier, and the next thing I knew, it was morning.